The specific legislative approach to advancing career-connected learning that is gaining the broadest bipartisan support in Congress is known as Workforce Pell Grants, also sometimes known as short-term Pell. Let's start out with what the Pell Grant program is as it exists today. For decades, this has been the primary way that the federal government supports low and moderate income Americans getting college degrees. More than 6 million college students receive one every year. But these currently are not eligible for most career-connected learning programs, and that's mostly because of the matter of time. There's a limit in current Pell Grants that it can't go towards a program that provides less than 600 hours of instruction. And so that leaves out most of these workforce education programs. And that is the proposal then is to extend Pell Grants to these shorter workforce programs. So there are a number of elements of consensus where there's broad bipartisan consensus about workforce Pell legislation, and I'll go through what those 3 points of greatest consensus are before we move into the next section to talk about where there are differences about what workforce Pell legislation should include specifically. So the first point of consensus is that just how much shorter the program should be. So all of the bills under active consideration would move the limit from at least 600 hours of instruction to 150 hours of instruction. The second point of agreement is that the size of Pell Grant that an individual student can receive should remain proportional to the cost and length of the program as it is today. And one estimate by the U.S. Department of Education found that if you were to extend these to the shorter workforce programs, that the average student would get about $1,312 to complete a program. The third element of consensus is that these programs must include provisions to ensure that the programs really do ensure that graduates are placed in higher paying jobs. So we'll now move to the case for and against Workforce Pell. The supporters of Workforce Pell offer the main reason for the federal government to do this is that more Americans would be able to get higher paying and more meaningful jobs as a result. Since they are focused on low to moderate income individuals, they say this would put the aid where it would do the most good for students. And a Department of Education study found that doing this would mean that 10% more students completed these kinds of workforce programs. Both Republican and Democratic supporters also observe that this is kind of a rare case where the federal government can provide more support that would require little to no increase in appropriations. This kind of rare circumstance arises in part because the Pell program is already running a $14 billion surplus. And they observe that with typical funding of about $20 billion per year, really these workforce programs would not add much. In fact, a Congressional Budget Office estimate indicates that it would cost about $144 million per year. So they argue this is just really so small in compared to the overall Pell Grant program, especially one that's running a surplus. Of course, they also argue that all of the benefits of career-connected learning that we talked about at the beginning would be provided through Workforce Pell. Benefits for students getting into higher paying jobs, for businesses getting the skilled workers they need, and the economic benefits for the nation as a whole. Those against Workforce Pell legislation argue that the best use of this money, if you were going to put more money into the Pell Grant program, would be to restore at least some of the real purchasing power of Pell Grants for college. Use the surplus, use any other additional federal support that's being considered for short-term Pell to actually restore that real purchasing power given how much college education has gone up. There's also an argument that opponents make that Pell Grants have always really been about college education and that we have different programs for workforce training and we should keep it that way. Pell Grants are a different program, and if you want to provide more federal support for workforce education, do that through those other programs. And then, of course, they cite the 6 major reasons for opposing federal support for career-connected learning generally, including not diverting people from pursuing a college education, the quality of the programs is too low, the earnings increase plateaus, and that sufficient investments have already been made, and that businesses really should be the one funding